Hi everybody, welcome to our video lesson on solving equations by taking the square root of both sides of the equation. So as we think about this, I just want to have a quick example here. If we take 2 and square it, 2 multiplied by 2 is 4. Now that's basic, and if we take a look at this, also basic. A negative 2 times a negative 2 is also a positive 4, because a negative times a negative is a positive. So if we think about what number squaring makes a positive 4, x is kind of saying what times what equals a positive 4. Well, we could say 2 times 2 equals a positive 4. And we could also say that a negative 2 times a negative 2 equals a positive 4. So the answer for x here is two different answers, because it could be the positive and it could be the negative. So if we have to solve for x in this equation, we take the square root of both sides. Because again, when we solve an equation, we got to do the opposite. So if this is x squared, the opposite of square is square root. So we have to square root both sides. So if we square root 4, we get plus and minus 2. So for each and every one of these problems that you solve today, class, you're going to have two different answers. So make sure that you have that before, like on your worksheet and stuff like that, before you move on to the next problem, make sure that there are two answers. So let's take a look at our first one. I want to get x all by itself. So the way I get x all by itself is I have to take care of this square. So what is the opposite of squaring something? Square rooting it. So I square root both sides, and I get x to equal the square root of 36 is 6. But it's not only 6, it is also x equals a negative 6, because it's plus and minus 6. So you can write it this way. You can also write it x equals plus and minus 6. I have no problem if you write it that way as well. Either way works for me. Let's take a look here at question number 2. So now I have a binomial that's squared. Well, I want to get the binomial all by itself first. So to get x minus 3 all by itself, I got to take care of this too. So once again, I need to square root both sides. Because once I square root a quantity that's squared, this cancels with this, and then all I have left is x minus 3. And that's what I want. What I do to the left side, I also have to do to the right side. So I need to square root 16 as well. So that equals the square root of 16. Now, what is the square root of 16? Hopefully you say it's 4, but hopefully you don't say it's only 4, but it's also a negative 4. So x minus 3 equals a positive 4, and x minus 3 equals a negative 4. There's going to be two different answers for this one, and all of these. So to solve for x, here on the left side, I'm going to add 3, and I get x to equal a positive 7. And then, over here on the right part of my board, I'm going to add 3, and I get x to equal a negative 1. This answer and this answer satisfy the equation. You could check all of these if you want to. You don't have to, but I think it's a wise thing to do if you're uncertain of yourself. You could say, well, if I got x to be 7, that means 7 minus 3 squared has to equal 16. 7 minus 3 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. 16 equals 16. Boom, it checks. You can do the same thing with the negative 1. A negative 1 you got for x minus 3, quantity squared, has to equal 16. Well, a negative 1 minus 3 is a negative 4. If you square a negative 4, you get a positive 16. So both answers, 7 and negative 1, satisfy the equation. So you need to have two answers. Look here at question number 3. We want to get x squared all by itself, because once you do that, then you can take the square root of both sides. So let's get that all by itself. We got to subtract 16. Minus 16, minus 16, and we get x squared equals 36 minus 16 is 20. So now that I have x squared equals 20, I can now solve for x by square rooting both sides. So I square root, and I get x equals the square root of 20, and I get x equals the negative square root of 20, or plus and minus 20. Now, make sure you do not leave your answer like this. This goes to yesterday's lesson. If a radical can be reduced, you must reduce it. So I'm going to break 20 down into 4 times 5, because 4 times 5 is the same thing as the square root of 20. So it's 2 square root 5. The square root of 4 is 2. So x equals 2 square root 5, and x equals a negative 2 square root 5. Those are your two answers here for question number 3. Question number 4. All right, I want to get this binomial squared all by itself, because after I get that by itself, I'm going to square root both sides. So my first step is to add 5. Add 5. So now I get x plus 1 quantity squared equals 7 plus 5 make 12. Okay, now that you have the binomial squared all by itself, now you got to get x plus 1 by itself by square rooting both sides. The opposite of squaring is square rooting. So what you do to the left side, you also have to do to the right side. So you square root and you get x plus 1. That equals plus and minus the square root of 12. Or, I should have wrote this instead, plus minus square root of 12 equals the square root of 12. And x plus 1 also equals the negative square root of 12. It equals both plus and minus square root 12. Okay, so what is the square root of 12 is kind of our next step. We can break this up into 4 times 3. 4 times 3 is 12, so square root 4 times square root 3 is square root 12. So x plus 1 equals the square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 3. So x plus 1 also equals the negative 2 square root 3. Alright, and now to end up with your answer, you got to get x all by itself. So you subtract 1, subtract 1. Now you can't combine 2 square root 3 with a negative 1. You can't add those together, so you got to keep those separate. X equals a negative 1 plus 2 square root 3. And here, on the other side, when you subtract 1, x equals a negative 1 minus 2 square root 3. You can't combine these again. You got to keep the negative 2 square root 3 by itself along with the negative 1. So your answer is really a negative 1 plus and minus 2 square root 3. A negative 1 plus 2 root 3 and a negative 1 minus 2 root 3. That is the correct answer here for question number 4. Here's question number 5. It's got a lot of stuff going on. We're going to get this all by itself first. So let's add 5 to both sides. So I get 16 times 3x plus 2 quantity squared. That equals 100. Next, I'm going to divide both sides by 16 because I want to get 3x plus 2 quantity squared all by itself. So divide both sides by 16, and that's going to be some sort of a fraction. We get 3x plus 2 quantity squared all by itself. That equals, if you divide both of these by 2, you get 58. If you divide them both by 2 again, you get 25 fourths. So 3x plus 2 quantity squared equals 116ths, which is the same thing as 25 over 4. Okay, now you are ready to square root both sides. So you square root the left side, you square root the right side. So now on the left side, you have 3x plus 2. And what is the square root of 25 fourths? Well, the square root of the numerator is 5. The square root of the denominator is 2. So 3x plus 2 equals 5 halves. And not only 5 halves, but 3x plus 2 also equals a negative 5 halves. Because remember, whenever you square root, you need both the plus and minus. So a positive 5 halves and a negative 5 halves. Now you're going to solve both of these for x. We'll subtract 2, and if you subtract 2, that's the same thing as subtracting 4 halves. Does that make sense, everybody? If you subtract 2, 4 divided by 2 is 2, so it's just like subtracting 4 halves. So then we would have 3x equals 5 halves minus 4 halves is 1 half. And then we have to divide both sides by 3. And when you divide both sides by 3, that's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So dividing by 3 is the same thing as multiplying by a third. So x equals 1/6. That is one of your answers. The other one is over here. You're going to subtract 2, which again is like subtracting 4 halves. So 3x equals a negative 9 halves. A negative 5 minus 4 is a negative 9 halves. Now we're going to divide by 3 to get x all by itself, which is again the same thing as multiplying by a third. And we're going to get x equals a negative 9/6. Negative 9 times 1 is a negative 9. 2 times 3 is 6. And a negative 9/6 is the same thing as x equals a negative 3 halves. Two answers. One is 1/6 and the other is a negative 3 halves. There's the correct answer for question number 5. All right, question number 6. If we add 7 to both sides, because you want to get this by itself first, add 7, and we get 3 times 2x plus 1 quantity squared equals a negative 60. All right. Next step, I want to get 2x plus 1 quantity squared all by itself. So 3, I got to get rid of u. Divide by 3. Boom, it's gone. Divide by 3. So then I would get 2x plus 1 quantity squared equals a negative 20. Okay, now I am ready to square root both sides. So I square root and I square root. Class, what is the square root of a negative 20? If you do that in your calculator, the square root of a negative 20, second x squared of a negative 20, and enter, you get a non-real answer. Non-real answer. And that's what I want you to put right here, actually. For x, there is no real solution. So I want you to put no real solution. There is no such thing as taking the square root of a negative number. Because a negative multiplied by a negative is a positive, and a positive times a positive is a positive. So to take the square root of something, you can only take the square root of positive numbers to get a real solution. You cannot take the square root of a negative number and get a real solution. It is impossible. So whenever you have to take the square root of a negative number, you're going to put there is no real solution. I hope all that made sense to all of you. Your worksheet is worksheet 10-6. So hopefully you could have good success with that. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me when you get to class again on Monday.